That's right. That's right. All right. Well, good morning and welcome everybody to dissertation defense of Natalina Martiniello. First of all, I would like to introduce the members of the examining committee. We're very honored to have with us Dr. Sylvie Cartier, who is the representative of the Dean of Graduate Studies. The external examiner is Dr. Frances Mary D'Andrea from the University of Pittsburgh, where she is an assistant professor of practice and a very renowned and acknowledged expert in Braille, which brings her obviously to this dissertation. The internal members of the committee are Dr. Mortis Cito, who is a full professor at the School of Optometry, and Dr. Walter Wittich, who is the supervisor and an associate professor at the school. And as for me, my role here today is to chair the proceedings, which basically boils down to make sure that the paperwork gets done and that everything goes in the right order. But I'll probably also jump in and ask a question or two. I'm also a full professor here at the School of Optometry, for those who don't know. So the way that we're going to proceed this morning is we're going to ask Natalie to do a presentation for about 30 minutes, give or take. And then after that, we will proceed with 2 rounds of questions. Typically the order of the questions goes from the external examiner. After that, it'll be, so Dr. D'Andrea will go first, then Dr. Tito, Dr. Wittich, myself. We'll do a second round, and at the end, we'll ask Dr. Cartier, as representative of the dean, whether she has anything to add or to ask, and we'll go to a general discussion beyond that if there's anybody in the audience that wants to ask a question. So if everybody's all set with that, without any further ado, Natalie, I'm going to hand the show over to you. And don't worry about it, we're not timing you, but approximately 30 minutes, all right?
Perfect. So I'm just gonna make sure. So Anthony, you're switching my slides. You can let me know when the first one is up and then I'll start.
Your slides are ready to go.
We're good? Okay, perfect. Thank you, everyone. And today I'll be providing a brief overview of my thesis on Braille and aging, supervised by Dr. Walter Wittich. So it is estimated that there are 253 million people worldwide with a visual impairment, and that this number will double in Canada and triple worldwide over the next 3 decades, due both to population growth and aging. Unlike the past, the most common visual conditions encountered in vision rehabilitation today are all those acquired in adulthood or later. Similarly, as individuals age, there is an increased prevalence of dual sensory or combined vision and hearing impairment. Many of these clients may be unable to rely on print for some or all tasks. And for this reason, reading-related difficulties are the most common reason for referral to vision rehabilitation. Within adult Braille rehabilitation, there are 3 categories of clients encountered. Those with congenital visual impairments who learned Braille early on, but who may seek services for changing needs, such as the attribution of new Braille devices. A small segment of those with congenital visual impairments who did not learn Braille either due to level of vision or lack of services and who may seek Braille training now. And the growing majority of those with age-related conditions who were previously sighted and who are now prospective Braille clients. All 3 of these adult groups learn differently from children and will also experience age-related declines that may influence their Braille usage outcomes. So there are various reasons why best practices for children cannot fully transfer to the adult learning context. Children learn Braille through the process of acquiring literacy, spelling, and grammar. And so an emphasis is placed on concept development and foundational literacy skills. Conversely, Adults come with a lifetime of literacy experiences and so require greater emphasis on perfecting the mechanics of Braille reading, which draw on capacities such as tactile perception, which are underdeveloped. Children who learn Braille demonstrate cortical magnification of the reading fingers and recruit the visual cortex. This learning plasticity is possible in adulthood, but the childhood brain is far more flexible. So unlike visual print, where several letters are perceived in a single saccadic gaze, Braille characters are perceived sequentially through the fingertips as the hands move across the page. This places a greater demand on working memory for new learners or for those with impaired tactile perception where reading is slower. Typical aging is associated with declines in tactile, motor, and cognitive capacities. In addition, there can be an interaction. For example, impaired tactile perception may increase the cognitive load needed for processing. Despite these age-related declines, very little is known about the relationship between these measures and Braille reading outcomes. So it is clear that further research is needed on Braille, adulthood, and aging, and this will become increasingly imperative in the years ahead. So my 4-phase research aimed to explore Braille, adulthood, and aging through 3 intersecting perspectives: by analyzing the literature, by gathering user perspectives, and by examining performance outcomes. Study 1 represents the first scoping review to gather existing knowledge on Braille and aging. Study 2 explored the enablers and barriers encountered by working age and older adults who pursued Braille training. Study 3 explored the factors that correlate with Braille reading speed by addressing the gaps highlighted in the scoping review. Study 4 consisted of a training intervention for older adults informed by the knowledge gained in previous studies. So the goals of the scoping review were to summarize what is already known about the relationship between tactile, motor, and cognitive capacities and Braille reading performance, what instruments have been used to measure these capacities, and to what extent age has been considered within these investigations. This article was published open access in Disability and Rehabilitation. So the scoping review methodology outlined by Arksey and O'Malley was used, and we conducted a comprehensive search using the keyword Braille through 4 peer-reviewed databases, as well as a manual search through the Journal of Visual Impairment and Blindness and the reference lists of all eligible articles. Only 2,405 articles were found using the keyword Braille once all duplicates were removed, giving you a sense of how small this research domain is. And by the end, only 36 were deemed eligible. So among the studies that focused on tactile capacity, there is a clear interest in whether passive acuity correlates with Braille reading performance. However, a wide range of instruments have been used, with only the 2-point and grading orientation test used most often in 3 studies respectively, leading to inconsistent findings about the relationship between these measures and Braille reading ability. Given that Braille requires active movement, more recent studies have explored the relationship between active acuity and reading performance, with the Leggy dot chart used in 2 studies, so a relationship was not found. One problem with these tactile studies is that little demographic information is often available, and reading is often defined using a vague can or can't read categorization. 25 studies focused on the motor capacity with a strong emphasis on finger and hand usage during Braille reading. This highlighted the importance of the index fingers and bimanual reading, but of note is that none explored the relationship between fine motor dexterity, known to decline with age, and Braille reading ability. 5 studies focused on cognitive capacities. By far, working memory received the greatest attention, though a wide range of tests were used. These tests are noteworthy because they typically relied on reading ability, such as the reading span test. None directly explored the relationship between tactile working memory and Braille reading ability. So importantly, there is little consideration of age within these studies. The age range of participants across all studies is 3 to 82, but the mean age is only 30. 20%, that's 8 of the articles, provided no information about age at all. Fewer than 1/3 of these studies included anyone over the age of 60. 5 studies directly explore the relationship between age and Braille reading performance, and 3 explore the relationship between Braille learning age and reading performance. But again, little information is provided, and participants are typically divided into a congenital and adventitious group. So this scoping review revealed that a wide range of instruments have been used to measure tactile acuity, but for the most part, these have not been replicated and have led to inconsistent findings regarding the relationship between these measures and reading performance. Second, none of the studies explored the relationship between these capacities within a single sample, potentially obscuring the influence of other confounding variables. Third, none of the studies directly explored the role of fine motor dexterity or tactile working memory, and there is obviously a heavy emphasis on younger participants. So we revisit these physical and cognitive factors in later phases, and we address many of the gaps highlighted in the scoping review. However, we know that from other rehabilitation domains, training outcomes are often also influenced by psychosocial and external factors. So study 2 thus complements the other phases by expanding upon the external enablers and barriers that influence the adult Braille learning experience. This article was also published open access in Disability and Rehabilitation. So in-depth semi-structured interviews were conducted with 14 participants between the ages of 40 and 72 who learned Braille between the ages of 33 and 67. Interviews were analyzed using IPA and then were coded by 2 reviewers using thematic content analysis. So among the findings, 3 forms of stigma emerged: self-stigma, the feelings clients bring with them about blindness and by extension, outward symbols of blindness such as Braille; public stigma, responses from the general public, which can lead to unwarranted interaction and a reluctance to use Braille in public; and clinical stigma, the often unconscious biases that clinicians bring with them, both about Braille as a code and about the abilities for older adults to learn new skills, which may influence their clinical decisions. At the institutional level, participants highlighted barriers related to accessing services early on and the cost of Braille devices, which would have increased opportunities to practice Braille. So it is evident that in addition to physical and cognitive variables, invisible factors such as stigma and institutional barriers also play an important role that must be considered. Turning to Braille performance itself, the goal of study 3 was to explore the factors which correlate with Braille reading speed throughout adulthood. So study 3 is therefore guided by 3 questions. First, what is the correlation between age and tactile, motor, and cognitive capacities among adult Braille readers? Second, what are the correlates of Braille reading speed? So unlike the scoping review, we explored all of these capacities within a single sample. And we also explored the influence of reading frequency, which participants highlighted as being limited for older learners. And third, what is the influence of reading format, paper versus display, and reading mode, silent versus oral reading, on reading speed? And so we felt that this was important to examine because none of the scoping review articles explored Braille display usage, and the participants in the previous phase highlighted that these devices may be of benefit. So this article was recently submitted to Scientific Studies on Reading. In terms of the tests used, all participants completed the MOCA blind, which screens for mild cognitive impairment. The scores were excluded from the analysis since the range was too narrow. For working memory, a tactile adaptation of the visual pattern test was used. For fine motor dexterity, the Purdue pegboard test was used to obtain measures for each hand separately and when both hands are used together. For tactile perception, 2 measures of passive acuity and 2 measures of active acuity were administered. To assess reading speed, passages from the International Reading Speed Test were presented in 4 conditions: on paper and display, and silently and aloud. So 46 participants were recruited, placing this study within the top 15% of sample sizes represented in the scoping review. In fact, there were only 5 studies that had larger sample sizes. Participants ranged between the ages of 23 and 88, with a mean of 52. The average age among all the studies in the scoping review was 30, so our cohort was considerably older. Braille learning age ranged between 4 and 63, with a mean age of 12. So majority of participants did learn Braille before age 12. 78% of the participants used Braille at least weekly. 10 participants used Braille for only functional tasks, and 36 for at least some sustained reading. So we explored the correlation between age of participants and the measured capacities to better understand how age might influence the underlying capacities important for Braille reading. Consistent with prior research, increased age was associated with decreased performance on all tactile, motor, and cognitive capacities. However, this was especially true for the 4 tactile acuity measures, which increased most significantly across the represented ages. So computed the correlation between all the variables and reading speed, and placed those with the highest correlation into a multiple regression to predict Braille reading speed based on the age at which Braille was learned, active tactile acuity using the Leggy dot chart, and frequency of Braille usage. This model predicted that for every year older that a person was when they first learned Braille, reading speed decreases by 6.7 characters per minute. So that would mean that someone who is 40 is reading at about 45 words per minute slower than someone who started learning at age 5. Increased frequency of Braille usage was associated with a mean increase in reading speed of 31 characters per minute. Finally, every 1/10 of a millimeter increase in Leggy dot threshold, meaning poorer acuity, was associated with a decrease in reading speed of 18 characters per minute. Consistent with previous research, silent reading was significantly faster than oral reading, though no difference based on reading medium was observed. So this study highlighted that age alone does not appear to affect Braille reading speed. Instead, learning earlier, having better active tactile acuity, and using Braille more frequently were significant correlates of Braille reading performance. This is noteworthy given that these factors were also highlighted as barriers by the participants in study 2, who spoke of delays to the start of training and few opportunities to develop Braille skills. Though no difference based on reading medium was observed, the participants in this study had fairly high acuities ranging from 1.14 to 2.55 millimeters. So this left open the question of whether a Braille display, given its increased dot height, would lead to better outcomes for those with reduced tactile sensitivity. So in the final phase, we therefore designed a small pilot training intervention study to explore whether speed and accuracy would differ when learning new letters on paper versus on a Braille display. Recognizing that paper-based Braille remains essential for some reading tasks, we also examined whether performance outcomes on a Braille display would transfer to paper. As of this morning, this article was accepted in the British Journal of Visual Impairment. So due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we decided to use a case series methodology as a precursor to a larger and more refined study at a later date. None of the 6 participants had any previous knowledge of Braille reading. The Leggy dot chart was used to measure tactile acuity. As shown in the flowchart, participants were assigned to one of 2 counterbalanced groups where they were introduced to new letters either on paper or on display and then transitioned to the alternate format. So the study found that learning new letters on display was about 12 seconds faster than on paper and 3% more accurate. When transitioning with those same letters, moving from paper to display always led to faster reading times by about 25% and led to an accuracy improvement between 5 and 10%. When transitioning from display to paper, half of the participants maintained a similar reading speed, while the other half achieved higher reading speeds. The benefit of the Braille display condition was more pronounced for those with reduced tactile acuity above age 60. So the results provide evidence that a Braille display could be used early on as a supplement to increase motivation for those with reduced tactile sensitivity. This is noteworthy given the emphasis placed on tactile perception and frequent Braille usage in the previous phases. Collectively, these studies paint a portrait of adult Braille learning as a complex and dynamic process. It is complex in that, like print reading, it draws on multiple capacities that cannot be neatly separated. Adults bring with them an invisible suitcase of influential factors, a lifetime of perceptions, prior learning experiences, reading habits, internalized feelings about themselves, their blindness, and their ability to learn, and external factors, including the perceptions of others, which extends to clinicians who may carry unconscious biases. It is dynamic because reading ability may fluctuate based on the interaction between those components. Turning to the implications, this research suggests a relationship between objective active acuity and Braille reading performance. So these measures can be used to establish a baseline and to justify the need to management and funding agencies for more concentrated practice, more time, and for the allocation of Braille devices. It might also be used to determine whether a transition to jumbo Braille is needed, though this decision should be made with great caution given the stigma towards Braille and aging that this research highlights. Finally, it can be used to help determine whether difficulties are due to tactile acuity or whether other cognitive issues might be at play. At the same time, this research highlights an important distinction between objective and functional touch, because we can see that participants with poor tactile acuity may still be able to effectively use Braille for their functional needs. So practice is needed to develop effective compensatory strategies, and such baseline measures will not take that into account. At the policy level, eligibility criteria is needed to consider the needs of adults with vision loss who may be neither working nor studying, and to consider looking beyond the adult client and how to address the forms of stigma that exist. It is my hope that this thesis will launch a broader conversation about Braille adulthood and aging. There are already several obvious next steps. So I examined correlates of Braille reading, but there is a clear need for longitudinal research that more explicitly explores the influence of aging, or how Braille reading and the underlying capacities change over time, alongside consideration of other demographic variables, such as accumulated literacy experiences. I explored enablers and barriers encountered by older Braille learners, but we need more targeted research on older adult learners and also on those who abandon their Braille training. The many barriers highlighted by adult learners calls for a comprehensive examination of the current state of adult Braille rehabilitation services, which I'm planning to conduct as part of my postdoctoral degree, as a precursor to improve policy and practice through stakeholder engagement. So we can see in this thesis that yes, older Braille learners will often have lower reading speeds, but there are different enablers that can improve this. That's very empowering to me as a clinician and as a Braille user, but these possibilities are also very intriguing to me as a researcher, particularly given the pandemic and existing service gaps. Questions remain about the implications of reading on a Braille display, the usability of these devices with older adults who have reduced capabilities, and the feasibility of remote learning using these devices. Ultimately, I hope that this research moves us away from the question of why should older adults learn Braille to how can they best learn it and how can we best support them. And so with that, I would like to thank everyone who supported this research, especially Dr. Walter Rittich and everyone on the committee. Thank you.